She was 19 when the fire reached her. No battlefield had defeated her. No enemy army had silenced her. A courtroom did. Months before the flames, the verdict was already complete. Not decided by evidence, not shaped by truth, but by necessity. This was not a trial to determine guilt. It was a process designed to make her voice disappear without ever denying God. Because once faith could be judged, it no longer needed to be destroyed. It only needed to be managed. The chamber in Rouen was narrow. Stone walls, a raised bench, a table for records and ink. No weapons were displayed. No chains were pulled tight. And yet the outcome was already sealed. Joan of Arc stood alone. No advocate beside her, no commander, no friendly cleric to translate conviction into safe language. Only questions. They did not bring her into that room to listen. They brought her there to finish something that had already served its purpose. Joan had done what power cannot forgive. She had made legitimacy visible. In 1429, she had walked into Orleans with nothing a general would respect. No noble blood, no formal rank, no institutional authority. And the city lived. Soldiers who had learned to retreat advanced again. A siege collapsed not because of superior force, but because belief had momentum. Then came Reims. The Dauphin was crowned Charles VII. Not quietly, not ambiguously, publicly, and in that moment, English authority in France did not merely face resistance. It faced contradiction. If Joan's claim was true, if God had sent her, then English rule was not a political dispute. It was illegitimate. That possibility could not be allowed to survive. So when Joan was captured outside Compiègne in 1430, she was not treated as a soldier of war. She was treated as a symbol that needed correction. The Burgundians took her first. Then they sold her. A transaction, a human figure converted into leverage. The English did not want a battlefield death. Battlefield deaths create martyrs. Martyrs create stories. Stories outlive armies. They wanted something quieter. They wanted a court, a church court, because a church court could do what an army could not. It could reach backward and rewrite meaning. If Joan could be declared heretical, then her victories dissolved, not defeated, invalidated. This was not about what she had done. It was about what her existence implied. So the court assembled at Rouen was dressed in faith, Latin formulas, clerical robes, the language of correction and concern. Everything was arranged to say, this is not politics. This is the church defending itself. But the purpose was political from the first breath. The man who presided over the process was Bishop Pierre Cauchon of Beauvais. Not chosen for theological depth, chosen for reliability. His position depended on English power, and English power needed Joan erased, not argued with. The question that governed the room was never, did God speak to her? That question was irrelevant. The real question was, who has the authority to decide what God is allowed to say? If Joan submitted her visions to the judgment of the church, she surrendered the one thing that made her dangerous: direct legitimacy. If she refused, she placed herself outside obedience. Either answer led to the same destination. That was the structure. Joan was questioned day after day, sometimes gently, sometimes with pressure carefully measured, always alone, always recorded. She was asked about saints, about voices, about clothing, about obedience. Every answer was written down, every hesitation preserved. This was not a trial that searched for guilt. It was a process that manufactured inevitability. The room did not feel violent. No instruments were displayed, but violence does not require spectacle. Isolation works, repetition works, fatigue works. Joan believed something fatal in that space. She believed that if she spoke plainly, the truth would be recognized. But recognition was never the objective. Certification was. This is the fracture at the center of this story. Not a clash of swords, a clash of jurisdictions. Faith in Joan's mouth was immediate. It did not pass through administrators. It did not request approval. Empire cannot tolerate faith that does not request approval, because empire is built from procedures, and procedures survive only when they are obeyed. Here, power found its solution. It did not deny God. It did not challenge belief. It made belief conditional. From this moment on, faith stopped being spiritual. It became administrative, not merely through documents, but through controlled language, authorized interpretation, and courts that claimed the right to decide what obedience meant. Joan stood inside that mechanism with one fatal weakness. She trusted that conviction was enough. She did not yet understand that truth requires a forum willing to hear it. This one was not. A trial like this does not announce its verdict. It constructs a corridor so narrow that only one outcome fits. One question at a time, one answer at a time. And at the end of that corridor is not justice. It is closure. This system did not begin with Joan, but in Rouen, it learned how to disguise a military necessity as a theological correction. Joan of Arc was judged before she was heard, because hearing her, truly hearing her, would have threatened the war itself. The power of Joan's trial did not come from cruelty. It came from design. Every question had a purpose, not to clarify, but to narrow. The court at Rouen followed canon law only where canon law was useful. Where it was inconvenient, procedure quietly disappeared. Joan was denied legal counsel, denied appeal to Rome, denied the protections normally granted to ecclesiastical defendants. Each denial was technical. Each one could be justified. Together, they formed a closed system. This was not an error of justice. It was a calibrated environment. The central problem the court faced was not whether Joan lied. It was that she spoke with certainty. Certainty, when it does not originate from authority, is dangerous. Joan's claims bypassed the entire ecclesiastical chain of command. She did not cite theologians. She did not invoke councils. She did not request interpretation. She claimed direct instruction. That alone placed her outside the system. The court did not attack her visions head-on. That would have invited debate. Instead, it questioned her submission. Again and again, the same formulation returned. Will you submit your revelations to the judgment of the church? On the surface, this sounded reasonable. In reality, it was decisive. If Joan answered yes, she admitted her visions required correction. If she answered no, she admitted disobedience. Obedience was the real charge. This was the mechanism. The trial shifted from belief to hierarchy, from truth to authorization. Joan was not judged for what she believed. She was judged for how she positioned herself within power. This distinction mattered more than doctrine. The court asked about her clothing, not because fabric threatened theology, but because clothing signaled order. Armor on a woman disrupted categories. Disrupted categories demand correction. Each deviation was documented, each nonconformity framed as rebellion. The process was cumulative. No single answer condemned her, but no answer could save her. The questions circled tighter. Joan was asked whether she knew she was in God's grace. This was the human breakpoint. In medieval theology, certainty of grace was forbidden. Only God could know. A trained cleric would have deflected. Joan did not. "If I am not," she said, "may God put me there. If I am, may He keep me." It was an honest answer. It was also fatal. The court recorded it as presumption. Faith expressed without institutional mediation became arrogance. This is how systems bend belief. They redefine sincerity as threat. Joan's answers were not heresy in content. They were heresy in posture. She spoke as someone who did not need permission. The court could not allow that posture to exist. The trial advanced through accumulation, minor contradictions, statements taken out of sequence, language recorded without context. Explanation was dangerous, so explanation was limited. The court controlled the pace, the framing, the record. Joan spoke, but the record spoke louder. This is where faith became administrative in a new way. Not through confession documents, but through linguistic traps. Speech was turned into evidence. Evidence into inevitability. The room never raised its voice. It did not need to. Pressure does not always arrive as pain. Isolation works. Repetition works. Fatigue works. Joan was imprisoned under secular guard, not ecclesiastical protection. This violated canon law. But no one intervened. The church court existed in form. In practice, it was embedded inside war. This is the deeper fracture. The trial claimed spiritual authority, but it served military necessity. English occupation required delegitimization. Delegitimization required theology. Theology required a court. The system functioned perfectly. When Joan signed an abjuration, a document she could barely read, the court declared success. The problem had been neutralized. But systems built on compliance cannot tolerate inconsistency. When Joan returned to men's clothing, a decision tied to survival rather than defiance, the court seized its opportunity. Relapse. A procedural category. No new inquiry was required. No reconsideration permitted. The mechanism had anticipated this moment. From the beginning, the process had not asked whether Joan was true. It had asked whether she could be made controllable. She could not. And so the verdict advanced. The court did not fail Joan. It completed its function. This structure did not end in Rouen. It learned. It proved that belief could be disciplined without spectacle. That authority could correct faith without denying God. This system did not die here. It refined itself. Judgment continued. Systems do not break people with force alone. They break them by narrowing the future, by removing exits one by one until survival itself becomes a form of compliance. Joan entered the trial believing that endurance was enough, that if she held her ground, clarity would emerge. Instead, clarity was denied. Her days collapsed into repetition. Questions returned in altered forms. Answers were revisited, reframed, stripped of intention. Time lost shape. She was no longer a commander, no longer a messenger, no longer a symbol moving through crowds. She was a single body in a cell, guarded by men who did not answer to the church. This mattered. Canon law required ecclesiastical custody. Joan was held by secular guards loyal to the English occupation. That detail reveals everything. The court spoke in the language of faith, but control was exercised through power. Joan lived under constant threat, never spoken aloud. Fear did not need articulation. It worked silently. Sleep was interrupted. Privacy did not exist. Her clothing was monitored, her movements restricted. These were not punishments. They were conditions. Conditions designed to exhaust resistance. The questions continued, not accusations shouted in anger, but inquiries delivered calmly, methodically. Each one asked the same thing in a different way. Will you yield? Yielding did not mean denying God. It meant accepting interpretation. Yielding did not require betrayal. It required submission. Joan struggled most with silence. Not the silence of prayer, the silence of isolation. She had once spoken before soldiers, before towns, before a king. Now her words echoed only inside a record she could not control. This is where the system tightened. Joan was confronted with the consequences of consistency. Every answer she gave was preserved. Every deviation catalogued. The more she explained, the more she exposed herself. Simplicity became danger. Complexity became guilt. This was the human breakpoint. Not a moment of pain, but a moment of recognition. Joan realized that the trial was not moving toward understanding. It was moving toward closure. She could not convince the room, because the room did not need convincing. It needed resolution. When Joan signed the abjuration, it was not because her faith collapsed. It was because her options did. The document promised relief, a return to the church, an end to isolation. It reframed compliance as mercy. Joan could not fully read it. She could not negotiate its language. She signed to live. This was not cowardice. It was calculation under pressure. But systems built on authority do not tolerate partial obedience. They require alignment. Joan's return to men's clothing, a choice tied to protection, not rebellion, was interpreted as relapse. The distinction did not matter. Relapse triggered a category. Category triggered sentence. From that moment on, the process no longer needed Joan's participation. The verdict advanced without her voice. On May 30th, 1431, she was led to the stake. There was no final debate, no theological clarification, no attempt to reconcile contradictions, only procedure. The fire was not a punishment for defiance. It was the enforcement of closure. Joan asked for a cross. It was given. She spoke once more, not to explain visions, not to argue doctrine. She affirmed belief. That belief changed nothing. The system did not require silence. It required removal. The execution achieved its purpose, not because it terrified the population, but because it ended ambiguity. Joan's authority could no longer circulate. Her presence could no longer unify resistance. The war continued. Power adjusted. Life moved forward. This is the cost rarely acknowledged. Not the death itself, but the normalization that followed. No uprising erupted. No immediate reckoning occurred. The machinery absorbed the event and continued. Joan's faith did not die with her, but its public force was extinguished. The lesson was registered quietly. Belief without authorization is unstable. Certainty without hierarchy is dangerous. The system had demonstrated that it could isolate, reframe, and remove a figure of faith without openly denying God. This system did not end with Joan. It did not retreat. It learned. And learning systems repeat what works. The silence held. The trial of Joan of Arc did not end with flames. The flames were only confirmation. The verdict had already done its work. What mattered was not that she died. What mattered was how she was removed, not as an enemy of God, but as a problem of order. This distinction is the final fracture. Joan was not condemned because her faith was false. She was condemned because her faith operated outside control. The court never disproved her visions. It never needed to. It questioned her obedience. That was enough. By framing the trial as a matter of submission rather than belief, power avoided open blasphemy. It did not deny God. It claimed to protect him. This is where faith crossed a boundary, not from sacred to secular, but from spiritual to administrative. Once belief required authorization, it became manageable. Once it became manageable, it could be corrected. Once corrected, it could be erased without spectacle. The church would later rehabilitate Joan. Centuries later. That timing matters. Correction delayed is not justice. It is containment. At the moment of her trial, truth was irrelevant. Stability mattered more. England needed its occupation legitimized. France needed its symbol neutralized. The court delivered both outcomes at once. This was not an abuse of faith, it was its reorganization. And reorganized faith behaves differently. It speaks more carefully. It aligns more quickly. It survives by adjusting its posture. Joan did not adjust. That is why she could not remain. The system learned something precise from Rouen. It learned that authority does not need to crush belief. It only needs to frame it. Accusation framed as protection. Procedure framed as purification. Removal framed as necessity. Never call it persecution. Call it order. This logic did not vanish with the Middle Ages. It reappeared wherever faith intersected power. Different councils, different courts, different language, same structure. The pattern was set. When belief threatens stability, it will not be attacked directly. It will be examined, recorded, interpreted, and quietly removed. Joan's execution did not destabilize the church. It disciplined it. The institution survived. But it survived changed. It emerged more cautious, more procedural, more dependent on alignment with power. Faith continued. But it no longer stood alone. The trial taught rulers something invaluable. That religious authority could be neutralized without revolt. That symbols could be erased without martyrdom. That silence could be as effective as fire. Joan's story is often told as tragedy or triumph. Both interpretations miss the verdict. The true outcome was not her death. It was the method perfected around it. From this moment on, faith could be judged without denying God. It could be contained without theological debate. It could be made conditional without open sacrilege. That is the inheritance of Rouen. Joan did not lose a trial. She revealed a boundary. Beyond that boundary, belief survived only by permission. This is not the end of faith. It is the end of faith without alignment. And systems do not forget lessons that work. They refine them. They repeat them. They institutionalize them. The courtroom replaced the battlefield. The record replaced the miracle. The verdict replaced the revelation. Joan of Arc was judged before she was heard. And once that became possible, it became repeatable.